Our last session is not a panel, but it's going to be a moderated roundtable in the style of Fred Friendly and the shows we saw on PBS many years ago. We're going to reflect on the ideas we've heard today, and we will seek to identify and synthesize next steps and best practices for what can help university leaders successfully navigate the intersection where the values of the First Amendment and the values of the university intersect. I refer you to the detailed bios on the website, but the participants in this roundtable are Terry Amsler, Director Emeritus of the Institute for Local Government's Public Engagement Program and former Director of the Oregon Dispute Resolution Commission. Jacob Applesmith is the former General Counsel of the University of Cal Davis and currently a Senior Advisor to California Governor Jerry Brown. Azar Majid, we welcome Azar back to the law school. Azar is Vice President for Policy Reform for Fire. Doug Schwant is Chief of the University of Missouri Police Department, and I got to know him as a member of Mizzou's Ad Hoc Joint Committee on Protest, which we talked about earlier today, and Doug was a very valuable asset in the work of that task force. Dr. Patricia Tejas-Irvin is Vice President for Student Affairs at Northwestern University, and we hope that Professor Howard Wasserman, wave at us, Howard, Professor of Law at Florida International, will be with us for the duration of this panel. A family emergency prevents Professor Wasserman from traveling to be with us today, but we've set up a Skype link, which worked very well yesterday morning, but not so well yesterday afternoon. And we hope that it is working well for us today. So this panel is going to, or this roundtable will be moderated by our own law professor, Ben Trachtenberg, former president of the Faculty Council here. And Ben, I turn the roundtable over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Bob. I want to thank all of the guests who have traveled to be here, whether they've traveled from the police offices on Virginia Avenue or from other states. I know you all could be doing other things, and I appreciate you taking the time to share your insights with us. I thank the audience for being here and all the organizers of this panel and the whole symposium, which has been extremely educational for me, and I've seen a lot of people with that I am learning a new thing look on their face that makes educators very happy and makes us want to come to work. So we have a lot of people on this panel. As you see, we've got 5 in the room, plus 1 on the Skype, plus me at the podium. So the time will move fast, I suspect, so we're going to get right to it. And Jacob, I'm going to start with you, if that's all right, and I apologize in advance if this sounds like a law school exam, but here's the fact pattern. All right, let us imagine that you forgot what it was like and you agreed to once again become a university general counsel. And the following scenario develops. First, a student group called the Alt-Right Collegians invites white nationalist Richard Spencer to come to campus and asks for use of a lecture hall. Hearing about this impending visit, the local chapter of the Ku Klux Klan seeks a permit to march through campus on the day of the Spencer speech. Next, hearing about this, the Black Jewish Student Alliance calls your boss, the university president, and demands that the Klan and the alt-right collegians be prohibited from having the events they want to have, but says that if the events are going to happen, they will be organizing a massive counter-protest to which they're inviting the 2 Als, Al Sharpton and Alan Dershowitz, and they would like you to give them money to pay the expenses of their guests because they don't have it, and they think it's necessary for them to put on that kind of event. So the boss turns to you and says, you're the expensive lawyer. What do you advise? What do you say to her?
First, I would say that I'm glad I just give advice and don't make decisions about anything. Part of the charm of being a lawyer is being, people actually have to carry out advice. But essentially, I would tell them, if I had not done so already, what the legal issues were. Largely, they relate to somewhat the Constitution, as Professor Post said, the constitutional rights we've decided to actually give out on our campus versus ones that are inherent in operating in a university. In California, like many states, those are quite extensive just because that's how we operate our universities. I'd also advise them what our rules were in terms of who gets to speak on campus, how we organize speeches, what permits are required, what we allow in certain venues, what our options are, all the legal issues I'd want to make sure they know about. But then I would tell them that, those are things we need to keep in mind and keep sight of. But in the end, this is very much about practical decisions making related to our campus and what risks we are facing. And I would say with risks, largely at our universities, they're reputational risks, right? What do people really remember about most situations are how the university handled them, what they said about the university, and where they leave us as an institution and how people look at us in the long term. And then I would also make sure that I would be stepping into my role, which I view largely is to sort of be the person who understands what rules there are, but more than anything is kind of the person who sort of is calm in the moment to make sure that we're actually paying attention to all the things that we should be thinking about. And I'll just give you a couple examples of that. A lot of times, and the chief can talk about this, a lot of times people say, well, if we get people in trouble, we don't really want to arrest our own students, so can we just sort of arrest them and move them to the side? And the answer to that is no, not really, because as the chief will tell you, once you start putting hands on people, things happen. You may have to put handcuffs on your students. Do you want to do that? You have the right to, probably, in certain circumstances, but do you actually want to do that? So going back to the event, if you just look at a lot of institutions at University of California, only student organizations or their affiliates can invite somebody. So Spencer's been invited. So he probably is going to be able to come here and speak with certain limitations in terms of how we regulate time, place, and manner. But I would also remind them that this is less about Richard Spencer than about our students and their rights. So just a quick example, when Milo Yiannopoulos came to speak at UC Davis, it was at the invitation of Young Republicans. Why did they bring him there? Because there's about 5 of them on our campus of 30,000 students who would actually stand up and identify themselves as such. They felt they were a minority that no one paid any attention to, and this was their way to get attention. So remember, this is mostly about our students, about our community and what we want to have here, less about Richard Spencer, although of course with Richard Spencer we're going to have to pay attention to the problems he can cause. And then we have alternative groups, and I am fully in favor of us sponsoring alternative events to try to defray conflict. We have to be a little careful sometimes as a public institution of what we're deciding is an alternative event. Does that say something about our values on who gets to speak and on what, and what we want to permit? But generally, I think it's a very good strategy. As to the Ku Klux Klan, were they invited by someone to come? Who was that? That is something we can evaluate. Is their purpose to be here a demonstration in a certain area? Is it to be demonstrated against Jewish students? I mean, really, it's an enormously complicated mix of issues. But what I also want to make the point, though, in terms of, it was talked about earlier, Dean Brown talked about this, the context, the long-term relationships and engagements we have with people. We really need to be engaging in our communities as that is defined from the core on out, and building those long-term relationships, because again, I really think in the end, as a lawyer and having practiced law for 30 years, I'm much, much less concerned about someone suing my institution than I am about what our institution is going to say once this event has passed. And obviously, there's the immediate aspects of people are going to be heard. So again, I want to be there to make sure that a lot of times the chief, I'm sure, would tell you this, administrators hear things from the chief and from the police. They don't always quite get it. It doesn't always sink in the way sometimes I think that it should. And a lot of times lawyers are there to sort of make sure that conversation is happening, but also, unfortunately, just the way people view lawyers, sometimes they just want to have me sprinkle holy water on something, right? That if the lawyer said it, then it's okay, and we can move forward. But again, I really would counsel on all aspects, what are our risks? What are we about? What will this say about us as we're going forward? And then obviously, in a situation like you described, really volatile potentially, very much focused on public safety and ensuring the police and administrators are considering those things as we go forward.
So, Patricia, let me turn to you, because I'm going to talk about the public safety piece in just a second. But let's say, for whatever reason, A group similar to the one that was recently in Charlottesville is now on its way to your campus, and whether for First Amendment reasons or just for a more straightforward commitment to free speech or university policy, your administration has said, we're going to allow, Spencer to give this talk. And whoever is coming to, stand outside the gates of the university, they're going to do what they're going to do. My question for you is, protests are likely, tempers are likely to flare, students at a minimum are going to be highly stressed out. As a student affairs professional, what do you think should be done to take care of the students, separate from policing and stuff like that?
So I just want to say, first of all, I've learned a great deal already from many of the speakers, so I thank you for that. And Professor Post, of course, in his talk really made me rethink, and especially as a private institution, because I'm at Northwestern, rethink about really questioning the mission, which is to educate our students, and whether or not, bringing someone who's really a provocateur, who perhaps really doesn't have much substance, should we invite them? Should we allow them on campus? So that's something that I'm going to take back to my campus and have a much more robust discussion with all the administrators. So having said that, that would be one way I would take care of my students. Do we really want to, and I hope I understood what you stated about the mission, and I think that's something that we all need to think about. But let's just say that they are coming and we've decided to invite them. Then, we have a number of steps that we take. First of all, we have a large response team that comes together, and it includes a number of different people across the university, including the police, student affairs, the students, and many other entities to really come together to figure out what we need to do to make sure that it goes safely. We can, for example, we did have Ben Shapiro last spring, and we made some limits. We looked at, time, place, and manner, and we decided it would be in a certain location, it would be ticketed, it would limit the number of invited. The invitees could only be students from Northwestern. We talked about how much time that person could be on campus. We organized so that our the first responders are student affairs staff, and they were prepared to be first responders. And then, of course, the police back us up. If it gets out of control, then we get out of the way, and the police. But I think reputation is something that we try to manage very carefully. I think when it comes to the students that are going to be affected, especially the underrepresented students that have a hard time, and with likely, rightly so, with these type of speakers, we have to create venues for them throughout the campus so that they can come together, whether it's in their safe space, whether it's the Black House, whether it's the Multicultural Center, which is in the residence halls, whoever it is, we need to make sure that they understand and we are listening and we're empathizing with the kind of impact that these individuals have on our students, because I think that's an important role that we play as administrators.
So, Doug, if you look in the newspaper when these high-profile events happen, particularly at public universities where all sorts of things are sunshineable, these numbers are quoted that it costs $500,000, $600,000, $800,000 for one of these events to happen. So, setting aside the money for a second, if the chancellor said to you, hey, chief, this is happening, maybe I don't want it to happen, but the general counsel told me I have to, or whatever it is, what resources would you need? Because I know that the MUPD is only so large, and even for homecoming, you need extra resources. So for an event vaguely like the one we've been talking about just now, what kind of resources would you want to bring to bear so that you could take care of the responsibilities?
Quite a few. One of the first things we do is look at if Richard Spencer's coming here. He was at Florida a couple weeks ago. Actually, I've already talked to Chief Linda Strump there about their experience and about their mutual aid agreements and responses. And we have mutual aid agreements. Our biggest partner here at the University of Missouri is the Missouri State Highway Patrol. They have a field force of about 600-700 that could be here in within hours, actually, if there was an incident. We use them 7 times a year for our football games, about 100 of them. So we have a great partner right here that are state of Missouri. We've also obviously got all our local law enforcement partners, and we have mutual aid agreements with those. It's important to have those ahead of time, ideally. We're fortunate because of our Division I football and basketball. We have, in many other reasons, we have mutual aid agreements with their tactical team, with their hostage negotiation team, with the resources. So it's important to have those ahead of time. So, one of the first things we do, Ben, is and everybody listening, is we reach out to folks that have had the most recent experience with that particular issue. We do that with concerts. I visited every Division I football facility in the Big 12 and the SEC. You know, you go to where people have experienced that before. You draw on your own history. We've had the National Socialist Movement here, had a march here, you know, a white supremacist group. And, you know, and the biggest thing about not only involving your partners and have a unified command, as you know, we're a small agency. If we're full, we got 50 officers. That pales into comparison what you would need for this type of challenge. So enacting those partnerships, but more important than that, and that's kind of easy in our world. We all work together: public safety, law enforcement, state highway patrol, county sheriff, city police departments. We're used to working together. That's a common thing for us. It's the important thing for me, and lessons learned over the years on a number of incidents, is that community engagement and not stopping at your campus borders, because it affects the entire jurisdiction. In our case, it'd be at a minimum Boone County, and in making sure you're engaging the community in the planning for this event. If the word's been given, it's going to happen, then there's a lot of planning that takes place. And I've been there, and we've had lessons learned where you forget about this group or that group. Almost everybody in your community is affected, and so starting those engagements early and involving everybody you can think of, and having a lot of input and a lot of planning, and many factors go into this type. What you've given us here, it would be not insurmountable, but a lot of resources and planning would go into effect, without a doubt.
So Audrey, I want to turn to you because people have been talking about you, and you've just been sitting there. My understanding, if my understanding is correct, right, FIRE advocates that even at private universities where everyone knows the First Amendment doesn't apply, that universities, if they're committed to offering a serious, rigorous education, ought to basically be doing what the First Amendment requires of public universities. And given what we've just heard about the tremendous expense associated with certain events like this that frankly might not provide much educational value, can you give us some background? What are the values that make you think these events should still go on, even though they're expensive and annoying? University presidents shouldn't be in the business of deciding whether to let this or that speaker give a talk.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think, you know, for FIRE, and speaking personally, what it really boils down to is truth in advertising. You know, if a university commits itself in policy to free speech, to academic freedom, and to protecting student and faculty rights, we take them at their word. And, you know, we hold them to those commitments in the same way that we would hold a public institution that's fully bound by the First Amendment. So really it boils down to that kind of truth in advertising, as opposed to sort of a bait and switch approach where, you know, you say, well, this is an institution where students and faculty can expect X, and then what they deliver is Y and Z. So really it's that type of question in terms of what type of institution you really want to be. You know, in terms of the second part of your question, whether these are still events that a private institution should be expected to foot the bill for, whether they should have the right to simply pass on that, you know, I want to caution against the idea of defining educational missions of institutions really narrowly. You know, I think Professor Post's talk discussed a lot about classroom expression and the greater leeway that universities have to regulate student and faculty expression in the classroom. But so much of the free speech violations that take place across this country that have been going on for years on college campuses have nothing to do with classrooms. They involve student protests on the quad, or they involve student expression on social media, or they involve professors tweeting things that somebody finds offensive. Really nothing that has to do with students' education in the classroom or faculty members' behavior in the workplace. So I really want to caution against this idea of defining the educational environment or the educational mission so narrowly. So I think, you know, that can't be lost in this conversation. And if we define educational mission so narrowly as to take out those conversations and those interactions, really what we're depriving students and others of is the opportunity to enrich their education, learn from each other, and supplement what they get from their textbooks and their exams from talking to each other. So I think really all of those things are part of the mission of the university. And I say that both normatively in terms of what I personally think a university ideally looks like, but also legally in terms of what the courts, including the Supreme Court, have laid out in case law spanning decades. So those things are and should be part of this conversation.
Terry, could you please weigh in next as a conflict resolution expert? What advice would you give a police chief or a general counsel or student affairs professional about how to handle hotly contested free speech disputes on a campus?
Well, I'd be happy to answer that question. Hi, everybody. Good to see you. A couple thoughts occur to me, and I suppose one thing this is just a sort of a riff on this, I think, but this goes back to me to the title of the conference, the Symposium, which was identifying, this is not the whole thing, identifying principles for best practices for engaging. I want to come back to it because that struck me as a very positive way to frame what we're to talk about today, and that goes to how I'd answer the question to some extent as well. Because it's an incident response plan, particularly, or incident preparation plan we're talking about. We're talking about a university community thinking about what these incidents, what these issues are, and how they should, what they are for the university, what the university is in relationship to what the incidents, the activities, the processes, the activities may be. It starts back up a ways. And I like that framing for the conference. So and that goes back a little bit. It makes me think about some of Grand Lum's discussions, some of the work with the Divide Community Program. It's a planning piece to some extent. I mean, it doesn't start with, okay, here's my advice. There's many people who can give advice on what to do at the moment. People better than me, than I could, for about university setting, who should work together. I teach a university, yes, but others of you would know more, I think. But I think it goes back to some of the discussion we've had today about community collaboration, university collaborative governance, democratic practices. It goes back to that fundamentally. It also goes, what's the problem we're trying to solve? What's the question we're trying to address? Like any conflict resolution issue, problem, controversy, dispute, whatever you got, what's the problem? That's the hardest thing about issues sometimes. What is the conflict? Well, you can't get people to agree on that, much less. That's why the whole position and interest thing is good, because you get people to talk about, okay, this or that, this person's coming or they not, or what's the university's role? Is this a teachable moment? What do we know about this? What is the law? Who at the university community talks about these issues? So this is a long way, getting back to your question to some extent. It goes, what conversations have been happening, have been taking place on the university campus, within the university community, and those touching the university communities about what these issues are, which goes to values and ethics and principles. And if you've done that work, everything else is easier by everybody. If you haven't done that work, it's harder to communicate your messaging to students, to parents, to potential speakers, to the press, to advocacy organizations, and frankly, what happens in cities doing public engagement work where they're not prepared. I assume where university, if they're not prepared, people then the university don't even say the same thing, and so the messaging gets funky. So if you've done the homework on the principle and the values and the purposes, if you understand things that may happen as one, I hope you've done your homework, or you know how you deal for a situation, you may not know what it is yet, but you know about the communication, the relationships, things that I've talked about, those pieces are in place, you have a framework. That's what universities have to do fundamentally, I think, to grapple with these issues. That's just a long way around to it, I know.
Well, thank you, Terry. And I'm going to turn to the other panelists in just a minute, because I was hoping to sort of shift. I mean, I started with this, there's a crisis, what are we going to do? And I'm going to shift in a moment to if we're enjoying some relative calm for a moment, let's look forward and try to plan intelligently for the future. But Howard has been waiting extremely patiently on Skype, and if you're, now's the time to turn off your mute button, if you would. And I'd just be interested to hear, because we had a presentation of First Amendment on campus earlier, and I couldn't tell, maybe a little bit of that was what the First Amendment would be if a certain professor were the swing vote on the Supreme Court. And I'm interested in, what do you think of things about what are the law right now that maybe universities need to be thinking of that we're not thinking of? pitfalls that we're looking out for, or doctrine that might exist that you think is terrible, that's getting in the way of us leading to smart responses, or frankly, anything that you've been thinking of as you've been listening to everybody else?
The law right now, that's a tremendous echo. I apologize. The law right now is that the public spaces on campuses are largely treated as in the same way that public spaces are outside of the university. The idea of the public forum in which content neutral time, place, manner regulations are allowed, and content-based restrictions are subject to strict scrutiny, with a little bit more deference to universities to both define who gets access to the forum. So, for example, my university, just like a lot of other universities, requires or limits public space use to student groups or those who have been invited by student groups and student organizations. And a little bit more leeway to the university to create so-called free speech zones to channel speakers into certain areas on campus and therefore leave students room for egress and ingress into classroom spaces and so forth. So it looks very much like what we see outside of the university, with a little bit more administrative leeway for the university. The other, just in terms of something that I'm thinking of, and this has resonated in hearing particularly about what happened at Middlebury earlier this year, is I think we have to figure out a metric for defining what counter-protesters can do. And one of the things that's disturbed me in a lot of the conversations about this is that we are labeling counter-protest or counter-speech to objectionable speakers as heckler's vetoes, and we're throwing that term around a lot without, I think, a really good definition for what it is. And it's being used to govern situations where the university, worried about student reaction to Richard Spencer or Milo Yiannopoulos, shuts the speaker down, and that's sort of the true paradigmatic heckler's veto. But we also apply it to situations where counter-protesters show up either inside or outside of the forum that the speaker is using, and they make a lot of noise. This is what happened with Richard Spencer at the University of Florida last week, where they showed up and they made a lot of noise outside of the building, and he wasn't able to be heard, so he just gave up trying to talk. And people labeled that a heckler's veto, and I'm a little troubled by that idea. And I think we need to figure out how we're going to define what is and isn't permissible counterspeech, and where counterspeech crosses the line into actual disruption. And I think that's something that we really have to explore, and it goes into a lot of the dispute resolution mechanisms that we've been talking about today, because that really is about negotiating between sides and how much allowance we're going to give to both sides.
Thank you. So I want to go now back to the folks sitting right here and say, let's think about planning for the future, right? There are conversations we ought to have. There are discussions about values that are themselves going to be contested, but will be easier to talk about when we don't have a crisis. And I'd be interested, whoever wants to jump in now, whether it's from a student affairs, police, general counsel, any of you, outside groups that are keeping an eye on universities to try to keep us to our values, what should we be doing? It looks like Doug is ready.
Well, I'm not sure I'm going to address what you just asked, but it touches on that, I believe, in what our guest said via the Skype there, is we have a lot of experience with this. Been in the business a long time, and there's a lot of different types of events. And if we've had events in this room, and if it's a guest event or a ticketed event, and there's folks that are invited, whether they be students or a student group or whoever the audience is, where there's an invite list, somebody's organizing it. There's much different standards to that, and how, whether people are screened when they come in and those kind of things, or if it's open to the public. Anybody, the first people to get here get to come in. When it fills up, they shut the doors, and or if it's a political speech. You know, we've had many experiences with the heckler situation with political speeches that were open to the public. And we've taken, our department has taken criticism for not shutting down the heckler speech at political rallies when it's free and open to the public. So there's very distinct differences in the type of setting you're in. For example, our football games, we eject about 20 people a game for behavior. And they've got a ticket to come to the event, but there's conditions on you being there, whether it be a football game or a speech or whatever it is. And so that's one of the first conversations we have when a student group's hosting somebody. And again, we've got a lot of history over a lot of years of different guests that can cause controversy. And one of the first questions is it restricted, or is it a guest list? Is it open to the public? First come, first. And then from there we start how it's managed, and those are important things for, I think, a lot of folks to keep in mind. There are very differences to us on the restrictions as it comes to heckling or behavior. If I decide to stand up and start disrupting this event right here, if somebody decides to stand up and not let us have our conversation, my guess is you would ask one of our folks to, hey, this person can no longer be here. You're not a guest anymore. And then we'd ask them to leave. And then if they didn't leave, we'd say, if you don't leave, you know, this is whoever's event this is, and we would talk beforehand about that. Ben's, it's your event. Okay, if you don't leave, then you're going to be arrested for trespassing. I'm not leaving. Okay, you're under arrest. And as we mentioned earlier, if we're going to touch anybody, there's an arrest charge. We're not going to just take you outside and say, go away. Once we physically have contact with somebody, that means they're under arrest for trespassing because they wouldn't leave the event. Again, I don't know if that answered I know it didn't answer your question, but I thought it's important to talk about that issue.
So I think one of the things that has been said over and over, but I think as we're considered a reflective group here, is that sense of community and making very clear what our values are. I mean, I don't think it can be restated enough how important that is. And it goes from the very beginning. It comes from the president, it comes from me, it comes from everyone, hopefully faculty as well, in terms of what are the standards of behavior? What do we expect? What does it mean to have a dialogue? Do we even know what that looks like anymore? But I think it's important that the university be very clear about espousing the values and expectations of the students' behavior, as well as faculty for that matter. But at the university at Northwestern, we've also this year talked about it at orientation for the first time, the importance of that and what we expect from each other, and what can we do about caring for each other and listening to each other. They've mentioned, a couple of people have mentioned sustained dialogue. We actually implemented that program 3.5 years ago. And we bring groups of students who are willing to come together from different vantage points, from different backgrounds. And it's a 10-week group that meets, and they actually talk about very difficult subject matters. But it's so true that by the end of those 10 weeks, they really do find certain commonalities. And in fact, some of them actually have prepared a project in the community to come together to do something good for the community. So I think those are the things that are very important. We also do restorative circles. We've done that. We actually did it last spring when actually a group of students took over a classroom with a faculty member. We actually asked the faculty member to sit down with the students because there was a lot of misunderstanding, and I won't go into detail because we don't have enough time, but they did sit down. And we had someone who was very, very adept at doing the facilitating of this kind of a discussion. And at the end of the day, after many hours, there was really great resolution and understanding. So I think that's something that more and more universities are doing this summer. We also trained about 40 staff members on that so that we can actually start to build capacity. So we also have community dialogues. This came out of another group of students that took over an event, and we decided it was very important for students to come together with administrators. And so every quarter, we actually come together with students in a big room. We feed students, and we talk about issues that are on their mind, whether it's about racism, whether it's about being a low-income student, whatever it's on their mind, and we take that information and we try to find solutions, and the next time around we either give an update on where we are or continue to listen. But I think listening is so powerful. And oftentimes I think people listen to react because they already have the answer. And I think teaching students, as well as others, how to listen so that you can respond in an understanding way is critical. And so one of the things that I've also come up with as I hear so many people speak is, the question is, are we doing enough to teach the art of disagreement? Are we doing enough? And my answer, I think, is no. And I think that we need to think about how to do it inside the classroom, outside the classroom, and really teach them the principles of what it means to have that kind of discourse where there is disagreement, and yet can you tolerate that disagreement? So those are just some of the things that I think are very, very important to kind of planning. And of course, we have a response team that is ready to go, and again, it's multidisciplinary. And I think that really helps a lot in terms of managing these kind of situations when they come up on our campuses.
Jacob and Terry both waiting.
So real quick, so one thing I would say, a lot of people talk about managing expectations, engaging. I think that's really important. One of the most interesting things I heard this morning was from the Missouri grad student who was on that committee, that they actually had policies, but they were scattered all over the place, so no one understood them. And I think you'd be surprised, because I've looked at a lot of universities' policies. Your policies may sort of be there, but they're probably scattered. They're probably not articulated in a way that communicates to today's students, and they also may just be bad too. But I really encourage you, don't take that for granted, because if you're going to do things to limit what anyone does on your campus as a public university or as a private university under the law of contract, people are going to hold that up at you, and they're going to hold it against you. And then the final thing I would say is that as part of this dialogue with our students and our community, people are really missing out by just shouting at each other. I mean, it's sort of the most interesting question to me about the whole thing with Milo on my campus was, who were the 300 people with student ID cards in line to see him talk, right? These weren't just, just people wearing Ku Klux Klan hats. These were just a mixture of people. And actually, someone on our campus went out and actually interviewed them. There were a whole mix of people who supported him, who opposed him. But if we don't get into this, as you're saying, if we don't understand why people actually want to go see him, what do they want to hear, or what about Richard Spencer, we're really missing something fundamental about understanding our campuses and our communities and how we're going to have that sort of engagement and management of expectations.
Just a random thought, kind of. Thank you. At Indiana University, at Indiana University, there are significant issues around Thomas Hart Benton murals, which you may have heard about, one of which one panel has to do in one of the halls, which was used as a classroom, had a Ku Klux Klan folks and a burning cross, and that was used as a classroom for some years, and probably for 30, 40 years, that had been an issue. It had come up, it kept coming up. Every few years it would come up. And recently they've decided to just don't use it as a class, after more discussion, more commissions and such. We won't use it as a classroom. The issues were too significant for people in that classroom. I mean, they tried to make it a learning, teachable moment, education opportunities about art, about history, about the fact that Murals was built for Indiana's contribution to the World Fair in 1933, if I remember, Chicago World's Fair. And it wasn't a pro-Klan mural, it was recognizing some aspect of Indiana history. But the point of the story is only that there's been an agreement of a kind to, okay, it's not a classroom, we'll use it for other things. But it's a teachable moment, and what happens over time with these things, there is some concern, at least on my part, that some of the work that we're talking about, I love your examples at Northwestern, that's a wonderful inventory of process options, it's really a nice inventory. But for something like the mural example at Indiana University, and I'm just using this as an example, and many things have happened around this topic at Indiana University over time and more recently, including campus forums and such. But there is a danger sometime when we then put it away You know, this stuff just kind of disappears then. The teachable, maybe teachable, but teachable for how long and for what. The orientations is another wonderful opportunity, what you can do, whatever that might be, I think. So I think this question of how long we keep this. And the other random thought is, sometimes I found in some universities, these efforts you describe, they are siloed, pretty darn siloed opportunities. It may be around one office, set of students, but if you ask most faculty on campus what was going on, they wouldn't have a clue about it. And I'm exaggerating. I'm not calling out any particular university, but I don't think that's not true. It goes to the larger issue of what this work is. It goes back to principles for the university. What is it? Why are we doing it? What's everybody's part in it? There's an element of that as well into making this work over time, I think.
You know, I want to go back to Professor Wasserman's point, if I understood it correctly, which had to do with counter-protesters. When you have these controversial speakers that come onto campus, and then you have students or other people mobilizing to protest against that person. And I want to caution against the idea of everything being labeled or anticipated as being disruptive or a heckler's veto, and to rather let the facts play out and see whether something actually disrupts a speaker such that he or she cannot continue with the event, or the audience is not able to hear the speaker, or what have you. You know, some of you might have seen that the University of Wisconsin Board of Regents recently proposed a policy taking its cue from the Wisconsin State Legislature, which puts forth mandatory minimum sanctions for disrupting or interfering with a speech on campus. And you know, the idea that you have this sort of minimum punishment in a one-size-fits-all model, to me, is a dangerous one, not only in application, but in the potential to chill counter-protesters. So I think, you know, a much better approach to that would be to allow individual institutions, their law enforcement, campus security, and what have you, to have the autonomy and the discretion to apply policies and procedures as they see fit based on the facts on the ground, rather than sort of anticipating that any such activity will constitute a heckler's veto or will constitute disruption. So, and you know, in addition to the Wisconsin model, we've seen in the recent days that the University of North Carolina's board is likewise considering a similar type of mandatory minimum sanctions policy. And I think that has the potential, again, to do a lot of damage, not only to counter-protesters, but just in terms of its chilling effect on campus discourse more generally. So I do want to underscore that potential.
Thank you for that, and I appreciate you bringing up the legislature, because I think Professor Post made some very sharp comments earlier. There's a lot of, I think, belief in this country that American colleges are somehow this bastion of intolerance and no one's willing to listen to anyone, and that the greatest threat to free speech at American universities is annoying students. And I want to suggest that the legislature should not be forgotten, even for a moment, because if you look back to the examples of North Carolina and Wisconsin that you just mentioned, there has been some legislative efforts, and frankly, most of that is not focused at outside speakers, although the examples you mentioned are sound, but are focused at research and teaching, right? That a lot of the research and teaching, which is the core, of course, of what we're doing, it's not all that we do, right? Student life, extension, entrepreneurship, et cetera, are important things, but research and teaching are the reason that we exist, and the other stuff is adjunct to that. And I'd be interested in anyone who has any perspective on what can be done to help deal with the controversies that are certain to continue arising about freedom to teach what professors ought to be able to teach, freedom to research and publish what faculty and students, for that matter, ought to be able to research and publish. Because even students at this university have had some interference from the legislature, and the chancellor at the time stood up for that student's freedom to research what she wanted to research. But that wasn't a trivial thing for him to do.
I would say just elect better legislators, which would be a nice solution. You know, I think a lot of people have been talking recently about this problem, that there's a general lack of understanding or commitment society-wide to the model of a university university that you just described, where we're here to reach and we're here to research and we're here to teach, and everything else is adjunct to that. And so the problem you have with, I won't say legislative interference because it is the state's university, but the problem we see with legislative involvement is they are reflecting what I think is a broader societal-wide understanding of what a university is, including a public university, is supposed to be.
And indeed, perhaps a private university as well. The Attorney General is talking about private universities and a certain attitude as well. But it looks like there were folks at the table who were just ready to reach toward the microphone. Any of you? Terry.
Well, I just want to go back to the comment that was made by, I think, Dean Brown, if I remember correctly, about looking also, not forgetting to examine the emotional, social, political context of speech issues. That's just a good thing to always keep going back to, I think. You know, we sometimes get wrapped up in a very narrow, we define these whole conflict things and issues so narrowly sometimes. What do we know from conflict resolution field? We know we better know what the conflict is, and be careful we don't narrow it so much that we can't solve the problem. And I think one thing that occurs to me, and it goes back because I'm thinking about Indiana University, and I'm thinking about the Benton Murals, and I think about the impact, say, and there was a story about this, an African-American student sitting in that room, seeing the Ku Klux Klan folks and burning cross, the impacts of that. That's a story worth telling. That's an issue worth talking about. There are these kind of stories often around any of these phenomena that we're talking about. This is another way, in addition to resolving the policy or creating the policy or resolving the incident or dealing with our public communications issues. It's about this. It's about these stories and their impacts on people, what it means for people. It doesn't have to be, this is the dialogue or agreement question. You know, you can have good conversations that are dialogic, that are around understanding, that aren't trying to resolve anything. And it goes back to the toolbox for conflict resolution a little bit. People have talked about that today. And that's another thing to keep in mind when I think about university responses. Are often, I don't care what profession or what industry, our response box often we narrow it so much often, as opposed to keeping it open, given what people are telling us they need. It's that responsive aspect to looking at what's happening on universities, when some of these things are happening, and actually talking to the people that are most affected.
Well, and I would suggest that at public universities in particular, there has been a failure, largely, frankly, on the side of the people inside the university, to go out sometimes and have these conversations, right? Some of the tension that we've seen at public universities with the voters and the legislatures has been some sense that there's a perception that the university's left the folks behind or isn't focusing on issues that are important to the people in the state. And that perception may be inaccurate, but if we're not telling our story and we're not willing to hear what other people think about their stories, then we perhaps shouldn't be surprised that there's misunderstanding. Were there any other points that folks wanted to make about the issue of research and teaching freedom? Because I think, you know, a lot of, when people say First Amendment at universities, they seem to think in particular about outside speakers making a lot of noise and bringing a protest. But the overwhelming bulk of expression on campuses is from people inside the campuses.
Yeah, so one thing I do caution in a very lawyerly way campus leaders about is decisions you make today, and this again goes to your student body, are going to impact what you're able to do tomorrow, right? So at Davis, there's a policy that says that signs can only be displayed if they're about university events, so, and only in certain places. There's other places where you can put up political signs. So in the student union, that is half sort of student groups and then half sort of just general cafes and other things, a big Black Lives Matter poster was put up. Well, technically that violates our policy, so someone asked me, should we tell them to take it down? And my answer to that was unequivocally no, because it was, no one was complaining, number one. Number two, it would have created a lot of problems where, at least at the moment, there didn't appear to be one. But at the same time, if someone wants to put up a White Lives Matter sign too, which has an entirely different meaning in our society today, beware that you're going to have an issue with whether you are going to have them both up there or are you going to take them both down? And you need to think about those things going forward. But it goes again back, we should be having those conversations with people and using that as an example, right? Let's have a conversation. What does that mean to have that sign up there? And what does it say about us? What does it say about us? And what should we do when someone wants to put up the next sign that we don't like so much?
Well, and your point about driving these conversations, it reminds me of there was an op-ed written recently by Fred Lawrence, the former president of Brandeis University, and there's a co-author, and I'm sorry that I don't remember Fred's co-author, but he talked about that one of the things that universities can do when there's speech going on that they don't like is engage in their own speech. And that while perhaps the university president doesn't need to denounce every speaker that comes to her campus that she happens not to like, at least sometimes the university can use its own voice.
You know, and that's a political judgment, right, as to what they're going to denounce largely. I mean, because a lot of those denunciations, they're not content neutral. They're really not.
They don't have to be, do
They don't have to be, but it subjects you to risk of someone suing you over it or it being part of something else. But I would also say, you know, reacting immediately to everything is really the skill of a leader as to whether it's important to do or not. Because one, you react to everything and then your voice just becomes meaningless. And two, you know, we ought to trust our students a little bit more. And one really short example, on our radio station, a kid had, an Hispanic kid he has a very political show. It's all music that's very political. He streams pictures. You can look at his blog, and he's got a bunch of lynchings on there. And it's a political statement. And so many people were so upset and offended. Student Affairs wanted to go rush out and tell him to take it down. But we were patient, and actually, because the radio station says we want to engage him. And then he did a whole radio show on how he wasn't trying to offend people. He did offend people. It was not his point. It was a bad message. He apologized. So the First Amendment worked, and it was all done by our students.
So I think there might be room for one or two more comments. I'll turn Audra, and then we'll see if there's one or two more, but I want to leave some time for questions, and the questions can be for any of us.
You know, to your question that you posed to Jacob and to the first part of what Jacob was saying, I think the danger when you have a president or head of institution denouncing a particular act or speech is that you may be accused of favoritism or, you know, favoring quote unquote one side over another, and that's the danger there. So you know, I think as university presidents and chancellors, there's a certain amount of selectivity that you have to have when faced with those kinds of situations. I think, you know, one thing that FIRE has recommended, and I think it's something that universities would do well to have in place statements of principles or a policy statement that expressly, you know, lays out the commitment to free speech and academic freedom at that school, and then any time a controversy like this comes up, you basically point to it and say, hey, look, we've already said our piece on this because of the principles that we've committed ourselves to, public or private. You know, that's why we won't be, you know, censoring or taking or pursuing some sort of investigation or punishment in this case. And that, and you know, the University of Missouri itself has done that, you know, in the very recent past by adopting a statement of principles modeled after the University of Chicago's very, very good policy statement on free speech and academic freedom. And I think that can have a very good sort of proactive benefit to universities so that anytime something like this comes up, they can basically point to that and say, look, this is something that we are consistent about as a matter of principle. Therefore, this is not us playing favorites or you know, favoring one side over the other.
There's an interesting question from government speech built into that comment, though, and that's actually something that we haven't talked a lot about in the context of the speech on campus debate.
Yeah.
Government can speak, and government gets to be, as you point, discriminatory as it wants, and it can take sides on controversies and pick sides, even if that makes one side look better than the other. At least part of the rationale for the government speech doctrine outside of the university context is democracy, is that it's popularly elected government branches or popularly accountable government officials who are doing the speaking, and if they're saying things that the public doesn't like, they can be voted out of office. We don't have that shape. University administrators try to do the same thing, at least to the extent the First Amendment applies similarly on on campus as it does off campus. Administrators should have that same freedom. We don't have that same democratic check, though.
Or the democratic check at a minimum is a lot more attenuated. And just to bring up one example where, recently at the University of California, there was a Jewish professor. He came, he gave a speech, and the student newspaper, I think the Daily Californian is its name, but the student newspaper published a cartoon that was perceived by many Jewish people as extremely offensive. And the university could, of course, have pointed to a piece of paper that said that it's a student newspaper, they can publish what they want to publish. Instead, the chancellor made specific remarks about why that was offensive to Jews and what historical tropes it was trafficking in and so on. And these are going to be complicated judgment calls, right? I don't think this panel can say, here's the guidebook to when you want to dignify a really ugly statement with the attention of the chancellor and when you don't. But I think it is the sort of thing that thinking about it in advance is likely to lead to better results. Is there anyone who wants to speak now before we throw it open to questions?
Just say
Patricia, you
something.
have a
It's
comment.
not about being against one speaker or another, but I personally do not believe that you can be neutral and not have a statement out when somebody's demeaning another group, when there is hate associated with their statements, and stay neutral. I personally can't accept that. So I do think that there are moments when we do have to speak out against that type of speech because it doesn't help anyone, it's not educative, and it only creates so much division within the community, and our underrepresented students are impacted immensely. And that was the last thing I wanted to say, is that one of the things we do at Northwestern is we do sit down with students when they've done something and really have a very reflective conversation with them about intent versus impact. And their intention might have been one thing, but really you need to understand its impact. And we're hoping that that will get them to start reflecting on their behavior or their statements or whatever they're doing to create an atmosphere that is really not conducive to believe greater dialogue or respect for one another.
All right, so
And I want to say one
One
thing
last
about,
comment
I
from the
want to not disagree with some of my folks here, but I want to present a little bit different perspective. In our world, in the world of public safety, law enforcement, we do remain neutral. I've met with the neo-Nazis, I've met with, you name the offensive group, and I've had to meet with them to help them plan their event to make sure it's as safe as it can go. And so we have to play that neutrality. And it's always, I've sat on the peace couch with a lot of different folks that I personally have not been comfortable with, but it's the reality of our profession. And then the other point I wanted to make is, there was a comment made by Jacob here about, choosing which rules to enforce when there are rules there. Hey, wait, let's not go there. This is, I don't completely disagree, but be careful with that. We found ourselves in a little bit of a pickle over the years. When you have regulations, rules, whether it be about occupations or buildings, and some things may be law violations, most are policy violations. And if you decide as an institution, hey, we're not gonna enforce it this time, but we might enforce it next time, be very careful about that. If you get a good, clear picture of what your rules and regulations are, which we did this this past couple of years, making sure you're willing to stand behind those. And if you're not, change them. But be careful about selectively enforcing those.
let's give folks in the audience an opportunity to come ask some questions. I'd like to thank all of our panelists for their remarks, and then we'll turn to questions in one moment. Thank you very much. So the microphone is right here. Because with this being live streamed, please come to the microphone to ask your questions. Looks like we got one person on the way to the microphone even now. Excellent. And then anyone else, if you want to sort of line up behind her, that would be great. Please introduce yourself.
This is Jamie Crockett again, and I have two questions, but one leads into the other. Being an undergraduate student at this campus, several years ago, there were organizations and groups. One specifically was the interactive theater group on campus that talked about difficult dialogue. So they would come into the classroom and they would actually act out a scenario and engage the student population to join them in that action, if you will. And I thought that was an amazing way to start the conversations. And I guess my question on that end is, do your campuses have anything like that that directly engages the students to work through these dialogues in an in an open environment? And then my second question is more geared toward current events where there might be certain symbols. So we talked about symbols, whether it was a burning cross or the Confederate flag, but specifically the symbol of statues on our campuses. And what would be the best practice or response for university officials with the removal of these?
So I'll just answer the first one. In Davis, we use a theater group like that actually for sexual assault. And it's incredibly powerful, and it's for all students. They have to take it. You can't register for classes your next semester, even grad students. And it's just an incredible program.
We also at Northwestern have a similar program.
And then any follow-up on the statues? Because the statue may not be a crisis, but as long as the statue is sitting there, it's an issue that people are going to want to talk about. Anyone have any thought? Terry?
It's a general answer to that question. I think the question of statues, monuments, and such are a really interesting one around dialogue formats, where people give people a chance. You're not trying to, is it remove it or not, which is a whole different thing, which, you know, at least in many cases aren't within a university's purview anyway. But it's a great opportunity to hear one another, hear different points of view on how they feel about it. I think there often has to be some realistic assessments of what's going to be accomplished within any kind of process that you're planning around any given situation or activity. But I think the monuments thing is an interesting one to me. I think it's richer than it's been made to be to some extent. I'm not saying it's not all the dangers and all the harms and all that. Yes, absolutely. But as a forum for dialogue, it's interesting. And it gets out than the being simply a tool and a hammer.
Audrey?
Yeah, I also, going back to your first question, it reminds me of, it's not quite the same thing, but it's, analogous. Williams College in Massachusetts, a private institution, there was a student there by the name of Zach Wood, who a couple of years ago, he organized a series of speaker events on campus called Uncomfortable Learning. The idea was to bring in different speakers, and in this case, Zach he's African American. He invited John Derbyshire, who, if you know anything about John Derbyshire, he's a very controversial figure, and he explicitly invited him as part of the speaker series to refute his viewpoints and to really take those on, and in the hopes that he and his classmates and his fellow students at Williams could learn something and change some minds, as a result of this. And the president of Williams College actually stepped in and said, no, we don't want you to bring that speaker to campus, even with this, obviously demonstrated student interest in having that dialogue. So, that's an example where everybody really lost from that exchange because nobody got to, to talk or to discuss or learn anything from everybody else. But that is an example of the type of thing that you're talking about.
Thank you.
Terry?
Last thing, I should start me on these things, but one thing that happens I've seen in Bloomington where there may be a community organization that's doing some courageous conversation-like process stuff, but they never think to talk to students about participating. There is this dynamic within communities about students get forgotten, where there may be some things going on, but nobody reaches out, so the old students don't participate. Well, because they don't know, and many don't have time. That's also true. But there are some possibilities for some of these things that really go beyond borders of university. Challenging all, of course, but there's missed opportunities on some of these things, I think.
Terry, it's like the phrase you hear sometimes in a university town where someone will refer to residents and students who live in the neighborhood. Are the students not also residents? But are you waiting for the microphone? No, you're not?
No, I was waiting, but I didn't.
Oh, sorry, I don't mean to cut anybody off. I was looking at the clock and,
Oh, okay.
Go ahead. You're up.
I'll be quick. How y'all doing today? My name is Chris Johnson DeLoach. I'm a second year here at Mizzou Law. And I apologize if this is duplicative in any nature, but my question is about athletics, and so I had to step out for about an hour or so. And so my question is regarding free speech in athletics, and so obviously we're very aware of what's going on in the NFL right now. And I'm curious to know your thoughts on how you see, or in the future, could that trickle down to the college level. ESPN released an article on the 25th, which is probably, I don't know, Tuesday or something of this week, where a Division III quarterback who was protesting during the national anthem, not protesting the national anthem, because I think that's often confused, but protesting during the national anthem, and was kicked off of his team because of that. And so I just wanted to get your thoughts on how you see this playing out in maybe the sphere of athletics, collegiate athletics especially.
Oh, and so before the panel goes in, just to add to the questions, we can maybe go for two things at once. There was another news story just the other day of an African-American student who was vice president of the student government at some university, I don't want to say because I don't want to get it wrong, who sat down during the Pledge of Allegiance and then he was then impeached. So this is definitely an issue that's going to recur in many contexts. So athletics or other thoughts about that form of protest?
Yeah, I mean, it's you know, I'll say it in two parts. Legally speaking, you know, there isn't a ton of case law out there to establish the fact that student athletes have the same First Amendment rights in their capacity as athletes that their fellow students do in their capacity purely as students. So legally speaking, it's a tough argument to make, at least until and unless we get some, you know, further case law developing that. Normatively speaking, of course, you know, as a free speech advocate, I'm going to say that since these are also students, they should enjoy some free speech rights, even when they are representing their university in the stadium or arena, and even when they're wearing their school's uniforms. You know, I think realistically, I would recognize that universities and especially athletic departments enjoy some greater leeway to regulate conduct that could be perceived as representing the school as a whole. So to that extent, you know, again, it's a tough argument, but we've seen some positive developments. You know, this is not something that just came up this fall. I think it was last year, there were a number of college football players that engaged in that type of peaceful protest. If I remember right, at the University of Nebraska, there were like 3 football players who silently protested during the national anthem. 1 or possibly more members of the Board of Regents called for some sort of disciplinary action against those football players, and the chancellor of the University of Nebraska actually, you know, stepped in and publicly stated that this is not something that they would be taking action against. So when you see those kind of positive developments, it is encouraging, and who knows, this might be something that down the road is developed in the case law. Right now, it's kind of a tenuous thing, and it's, you know, it's happening by the day. You know, you mentioned the issue with a student government member. Earlier this fall, there was also, I think there were cheerleaders at Kennesaw State University, if I have it right, in Georgia, who were suspended for engaging in the same kind of peaceful protest. So, you know, it's changing by the week and by the month, and who knows, you know, fairly soon we might have a more concrete answer on that.
Terry.
Normally speaking, I would hope that we don't allow the fact that students are involved in extra things beyond the classroom, such as student government or athletics, to that drastically undercut their rights. If the point of all this, I mean, supposedly the point of athletics at a university is to, you know, create well-rounded individuals and you know, sound mind, sound body, and that supposed mission, that when somebody does try to exercise citizenship in that way and using the platform that's been given to them in a way that in any other context is constitutionally protected, that that we would encourage that rather than imposing a sanction on it.
Yeah, I can follow up. That's right, I think, and not speaking to the sort of constitutional or free speech aspects of it, but I think in terms of going back to the purposes of educational institutions, which are something to do about education, and thinking about everything from civics learning and all that it might include, these are teachable moments around these things. I don't mean by instruction to people. I mean, these are topics that people know of. This is happening. People know about this. You don't have to be a specialist in some obscure art to know that this is an issue and people care and stuff's happening. So for a university that has thought this through, has sets of principles and guidance policies and documents about it, you know, this might be seen as a teachable moment. And these might be things that could be interesting dialogues. These could be opportunities for people to have voice, to express differences of opinions, to hear opinions perhaps different from theirs. This goes back to, again, to the optimal uses of these opportunities around deliberative discourse, as opposed to if it's only becomes we're responding to an incident. And it's a question is framing initially of what the problem is. If the problem is, and I don't mean problem, meaning not the issue is. You know, I think this is a fascinating, I think this would be a great topic.
And this is a topic that likely will demonstrate further differences between public and private universities, right? The issue at Northwestern is different than the issue at the University of Illinois. The issue at Mizzou is different than the issue at Washington University, both because often of the role of athletics and the sort of symbolism of the athletics of big state U to the folks of the state, but also just that, Northwestern doesn't get a big budget appropriation, so it can't be taken from them. And so there's certain freedom that comes with paying your own bills, as, eventually my children will learn. But now they're 5 and 8, so they don't know it yet. Did you have a follow-up question? Or was it? Okay, thank you. Anybody else who has a question? We have a few minutes left. Please.
I'd like to ask, how important is it, and really maybe this is mostly for Azahari, I apologize. How important is it that the actual person who is the controversial speaker be permitted on the campus? And if we're talking about exposure to ideas, generating dialogue, if a faculty member had, given a kind of a fair and thorough summary of what Charles Murray had to say about his most recent book, would the campus have been able to get the idea into discourse without bringing the person who was associated with so much earlier problematic discourse that wasn't actually necessarily relevant to the new topic they wanted to have in? I just wondered if you could speak to that a bit.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I'll be honest in saying that I'm not quite sure myself. It's $600,000 is a lot to pay for a university to foot the bill to have Richard Spencer come to campus in an event that may or may not change anyone's minds and may or may not lead to any reasonable, meaningful debate. So when you look at it, I think in isolation, you think, boy, that's a waste of money. Is that really a good use of resources, or is that something that we should try to find a way around? I think, I'll make 2 points. One is, I think more broadly speaking, there is a dangerous precedent set once you start denying that space and denying it on the basis that the university simply does not want to foot that kind of a security bill, because where does it leave the state of free speech on that campus and on campuses generally moving forward? Today it's Richard Spencer. Tomorrow it's somebody who's less controversial but still unwanted by some segment of the campus community or by the administration. The next day it's somebody who's maybe simply conservative, but not somebody that most people would label as a racist or a bigot. I think once you go down that path, there's no logical end, and that's the danger as I see it. Now here is one situation where I think there is a meaningful distinction between public and private institutions. I think one thing that FIRE would say is that if you're a public university, you are fully bound by the First Amendment. And there's a cost that comes with upholding the First Amendment. In some cases, it's a financial cost. In some cases, it's a cost in terms of other things or resources or people's time. Whereas, of course, a private university doesn't have that same legal obligation. So maybe, legally speaking, they have an easier argument in terms of passing the buck on that. So I do see a distinction here between public and private. But generally speaking, I just see a danger in terms of setting the precedent for denying speakers a forum or a platform just based on security costs.
I think that raises two interesting thoughts that I think we'd have to consider more to be able to answer the question. And one is, how important at a university, how important is the primary source? How important is it that we read or hear the original source as opposed to read a secondary source describing that first source? And it's something that we think about in the classroom all the time, and I think the same consideration would apply here. The second question, and why I'm not sure what you suggest might be the answer is we have seen issues where the objection is to the content being taught, not to the speaker coming to campus. So there would be, we might see the same objections to somebody teaching the work of Charles Murray or Milo Yiannopoulos or, insert whomever here, or talking about Israel in a certain way. We get the same objection from that content being presented, even if the primary source was not coming to campus. So it may not alleviate the objections that we see. It just may cost less than $600,000.
Sorry.
Just real quick. The one thing that I agree with everything said. I think one other additional way to think about this perhaps might be, there's one thing to people speak or not speak. Well, that's one thing. And there are interests of the university, given their purposes and missions and all that cost. But there's also speak how, in what forum, and perhaps with who else. There are process options in almost anything. You can bring people to speak, but maybe they don't just speak. Maybe it's set up as a forum, a debate, a multi-panel. I mean, there's different ways to do it, I would think. Now, I don't know the finer points of that, and I am not a lawyer. But nonetheless, I think that sometimes, again, these get framed in too narrow a way than to think the full range of options that might be available.
All right. I'd like to thank our panelists once again for coming and being here and sharing their thoughts. I'd like to thank everyone else for coming. Thank you again. We're going to very briefly have some concluding remarks from our organizers or our sponsors, as the case may be.
Well, trust me, this will be brief. When I got up this morning, I knew I would hear some good ideas today, but I had no idea I would hear so many good ideas, so many thought-provoking ideas. It'd be presumptuous to try to summarize this day, my goodness. But I would want to thank all of our speakers for coming. I want to thank all of the staff who put this together. I want to thank all of you for coming. Chris?
Oh, absolutely. Well, didn't know I was going to be doing this. Okay. Well, I guess just thinking about all of this, the one thing that I take away from this is it seems sort of writ large that what we've been talking about is what it means to be a member of a community. And I mean that not just legally, but also sort of morally and ethically. So what are our rights and what are our responsibilities? I think we should exercise our rights. That's a good thing, but that sometimes comes with consequences. And I leave you with the talk I had with my daughter when her high school principal amended the dress code to include what I don't think was a First Amendment violation, but might have been a 14th Amendment violation. It was a tad bit vague, since he was allowed to determine what was and was not acceptable dress. And she wanted to protest it by wearing a crop top. And I said, that's all right. That is symbolic speech, and you may do that, and I support your right. But let's talk about what's probably going to happen to you. And then I cannot stop the detention that you may or may not get. So we were having a citizenship discussion, and I think that's an important thing for us all to talk about, whether our children are 14 or whether we have students who are in college or law school, and to keep having that conversation for the rest of our lives. And I will leave you with that. By the way, she wore the crop top. So.
Thanks, Chris. We're adjourned.